A Catholic church in Gaza sheltering hundreds of Palestinian civilians has come under siege from the IDF. Amongst those inside are family members of British Lib Dem MP Layla Moran. This is how she described the situation to the BBC over the weekend.
Well, it's been deteriorating all week. I haven't had an update overnight, and we are now at the point where there is that blackout and the generators have gone. So I'm not sure we're going to get anything, which is terrifying, of course. So it's been getting from bad to worse for a while. We lost a family member who desperately needed a hospital just a few weeks ago and wasn't able to get out. But the escalation really began on Tuesday. There was shooting. They reported seeing white phosphorus. They were obviously terrified. They all went back into sort of the Sunday school rooms in the complex in the Latin church where they are. And they then heard that the janitor had been shot, the bin collector had been shot, and this was from forces who were outside at that stage. Then about 48 hours ago, it escalated yet again. There are 3 generators. 2 of them had already stopped working. So already there was dwindling electricity to charge their phones to communicate what was happening to them. But the 3rd caught fire. We understand that was because soldiers had hit it. They managed to put the fire out. But that was the generator that pumped any water. Already they were drinking contaminated water. They were down to sort of a meal a day. But this was sort of the last straw. So the last we heard is that now they are without water, without food, and there is a sniper inside the compound. There's a woman and her daughter who have been killed. And what's been happening is as they try and leave their rooms, say to go to the toilet or something, there is firing at them.
Moran made reference there to a mother and daughter killed by Israeli snipers. That killing has also been confirmed by the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem. They released this statement. Around noon today, December 16th, 2023, a sniper of the IDF murdered 2 Christian women inside the Holy Family Parish in Gaza, where the majority of Christian families have taken refuge since the start of the war. Nahida and her daughter Samar were shot and killed as they walked to the sisters' convent. One was killed as she tried to carry the other to safety. 7 more people were shot and wounded as they tried to protect others inside the church compound. No warning was given, no notification was provided. They were shot in cold blood inside the premises of the parish where there are no belligerents, being murdered in church. The Patriarchate also said there are 3 projectiles fired by an Israeli tank and that had hit a convent of the Sisters of Mother Teresa charity. Its generator and fuel supplies were destroyed, with a building housing 54 disabled people left uninhabitable. Pope Francis has also condemned the attack, giving this address from the Vatican yesterday.
Unarmed civilians are being bombed and shot at, and this has even happened inside the Holy Family Parish complex, where there are no terrorists but families, children, and sick people with disabilities, nuns. Some say it's terrorism, it's war. Yes, it is war, it is terrorism.
It's highly unusual for the Pope to make such an explicit statement, just straightforwardly accusing Israel of acts of terrorism. But the Pope wasn't the only religious leader to condemn Israel's targeting of civilians sheltering in a church. Cardinal of Westminster, Vincent Nichols, has appeared on Sky News, where he was asked about the attack on the church.
What explanation could there be?
I don't know. I don't know about the management of soldiers in uniform and the discipline that they should be exercising. But we've seen in a number of ways that discipline has broken down. And these would appear to be just random shootings. So I hope those responsible for it, because this is a structured army, will be held to account for what they've done.
You wouldn't go as far as how the Pope has described the situation. Incredibly strong language from the Holy Father saying that it was a terrorist attack.
Well, I'm not sure the technicalities, frankly. This is the army of a state. So I would prefer to say it was a cold-blooded killing. And what is so terrible is it's just one example of what would seem to be many, but one example that touches me deeply and one example from which we have some very objective evidence.
A cold-blooded killing by the Israeli state. Again, very strong words from a church leader. So, what did Israel have to say about that condemnation? On Sky News, Benjamin Netanyahu's senior advisor, Mark Regev, said this.
I would reject the categorization of the words he used, cold-blooded killing. That would indicate a deliberate targeting of civilians. That's something we don't do. We don't shoot people who are going to church to pray. It just doesn't happen. That's not the way the IDF operates. That's against our rules of engagement. We don't know exactly what happened, and I would urge people not to jump to conclusions. There have been in the past all sorts of stories put out by Hamas and their supporters accusing Israel of all sorts of terrible deeds, and in the end they've proved to be wrong. And we're talking about a combat area. There's exchanges of fire between Israeli forces and the Hamas terrorists. To say that Israel is deliberately targeting Christian worshippers, that's a terrible accusation that is unfounded.
Would you acknowledge, Mr. Regev, that the bullets that killed these women were fired by the IDF?
I do not know that to be true. Obviously, we're looking into it. Could they have been killed by Palestinian terrorists who were shooting at our people indiscriminately? I don't know. But we've got to be very careful. There have been countless stories since this conflict began, where reports out of Gaza, people are 100% sure that Israel did something terrible or this, that, or the other. And in the end, it's been proven conclusively that that was not the case.
God, they just lie through their teeth, don't they? This idea that the IDF doesn't attack people in religious buildings or around religious buildings. We've seen what happens at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We've seen what's happening at the churches. And we're also struggling to remember examples of reports of Israeli atrocities that were proven not to be the case. Though we could come up with plenty of Israeli claims that turned out to be pretty doubtful. Now, the siege of the church continues across Christmas, with the situation apparently deteriorating quickly. This morning, Layla Moran gave LBC a further update on the situation.
The escalation in the last week has been the worst we've seen. On Tuesday, they, and these are the reports we're getting from inside the church, there was firing. They reported the use of phosphorus. There was a sniper that killed 2 women, and this is what the Pope was referring to. They are living in Sunday school rooms. So the complex itself is the church, but then several rooms around a courtyard. And the circumstances of the women dying was they were trying to get to the toilet. One was a grandma, one is a mum, middle-aged, and they were simply trying to go to the toilet, and they were targeted by the sniper. The latest is the last generator's now gone. That was blown up. That was the one that pumped the water and filtered the water from the well. So there is no water nor food, and there are more snipers now that are pointing their guns towards the church and the building opposite. So, I mean, we are terrified. They are, of course, terrified. We're getting snatched conversations with them, but because there's no electricity now, we are, it's 30 seconds, are you still alive kind of conversation. We just don't understand what the IDF are doing. Yesterday, they called the father and said, we're going to give you 2 hours where we're not going to shoot at you, which allowed them to be able to go from room to room and check who's got water. They're down to almost nothing. But what that says, just turn that on its head for a moment. If they're going to give them 2 hours where we're not going to shoot at civilians, that does rather seem to admit that they are shooting at civilians, and hence our deep concern for what's happening there. I'm just not sure they're going to survive the week. Our plea to the Israeli government is just leave them alone. They haven't hurt anybody. They have nothing to do with Hamas, nothing at all. And we just do not understand what the Israeli Defense Forces are trying to do here.
After that interview with Moran, Nick Ferrari talked to Israeli spokesperson Eylon Levy.
Mr. Levy, noting you have every right, Israel has every right to defend itself in the face of the October 7th massacre, but when the Pope starts using the language that he's using, as he did yesterday, you're not suggesting he's lying, are you?
Well, we do not know whether... We know that a lot of incorrect information is getting out of the Gaza Strip, and I'll give you an example involving the church. It was in the middle of November when Hamas made up a story of an Israeli airstrike on a hospital. And
this isn't Hamas. I'm sorry to talk
No,
over you, sir.
I know, Nick.
This is a British MP.
I know, and I understand, Nick, but I just want to give an example of some of the misinformation coming out of the Gaza Strip. It was the Dean of St. George's who claimed that that hospital had received a direct airstrike from Israel. It then turned out in the morning the hospital was still standing. And a month later, he said that the hospital was in fact fully operational. So we know that there is incorrect information coming out of the Gaza Strip, including sometimes, unfortunately, from religious organizations. And we take very seriously our obligation to protect sensitive sites. And, of course, to target the Hamas monsters who perpetrated the October 7 massacre.
But what of the point made by the British MP that there's this sort of 2-hour stay of hostilities or 2-hour cessation? Why would the IDF say that if it wasn't possible for the other 22 hours of every day?
Well, we are talking about intense combat zones. Israel is going door to door and fighting Hamas terrorists who have embedded themselves inside civilian areas.
Why a church where we are told everyone there is a member of the congregation, so we are told. It is not being used by Hamas operatives, and for 22 hours a day, people are under threat of being shot. How would you justify that?
Civilians are not under threat of being shot. We have been urging civilians since the start of this war to relocate to the humanitarian zone, which is an area where Hamas has not embedded itself under schools, homes, and hospitals. We don't want to see people being hurt, and that's why we want them to get out of areas where Hamas is operating.
Levy is referring there to the Al-Ali hospital, where an explosion in October, not November, killed between 100 and 300 people. That's according to US intelligence officials. Some organizations have said a misfired Palestinian missile was to blame, while others say the evidence points to an Israeli airstrike. But neither Israel nor Hamas have yet made all the evidence available to investigators. The IDF has denied any involvement in killings at the church. This is what Cardinal of Westminster, Vincent Nichols, thought of that claim, though.
The Israeli Defence Force says it didn't happen, wasn't there?
Well, I think that's hard to believe, frankly, because the people in Gaza and the Cardinal Archbishop of Jerusalem, they're not given to tell lies.
So you don't believe the Israeli Defence Force?
No, I don't.
It's just the same playbook, isn't it? A church, a school, a hospital. Ash, the IDF keeps seeing Hamas everywhere. At what point is the world going to wake up and say, well, perhaps it's not that Hamas is everywhere, it's that the IDF want to raise Gaza to the ground and take with it its infrastructure?
I think one of the things I would maybe critique in what you're saying is that you assume that people don't already know that, all right? The British government, the American government are already well aware that the IDF is not operating a proportionate or discriminate military operation. It is plain to see that you've got attacks on civilian infrastructure. That's, of course, what the IDF said from the very beginning. They're going for damage and not precision. They've said outright that because tunnels may be under, any civilian building, that would automatically make those buildings combat zones, regardless of whether or not you find tunnels actually going under those buildings, regardless of whether or not you actually find evidence of those buildings being used as command and control centers. This is something which has been perfectly obvious since October, that the IDF are saying Hamas is everywhere because that gives them the flimsiest of excuses to carry out an operation of wide-scale terrorism, intimidation, violence, annihilation across swathes of the Gazan population. Right? It's always been a pretext. It's about punishing Gaza for what Hamas and for what the PIJ did on October 7th. That's always what it's been about. And then, carry out a program of ethnic cleansing, which ultimately benefits the expansionist aims of the Israeli state. So I don't think it's a case of the world waking up. Britain and America know what it is they co-signed. They just think that it's worthwhile because they consider Israel an ally, and while the rest of them, they're only Palestinians, aren't they?
Do you think it's interesting that Catholic leaders are getting involved?
It's really understandable that Catholic leaders are getting involved. I mean, this is the thing. The Vatican takes it very seriously when one of its churches and its congregation is under attack. That's the job of the Vatican, to show that leadership for the entire Catholic community. I think one of the reasons why this has become such a big story is because you've got this element of the Pope speaking up, who's, regarded as a widely a political figure. And here in the UK, you've got the relatives of a sitting British MP, a relatively senior one, caught up in this horrible siege on a church compound. And I think there's a third element as well, which is when you can smear the civilian victims of Israel's bombardment and invasion of the Gaza Strip as jihadists or potential jihadists because they're Muslim, it's one thing. But when they're Catholic, which for people who are looking at the world through a racist lens will go, oh, it means you've got something more, in common with us in the West because you're Christian, because you're part of, what gets lumped together as a Judeo-Christian heritage. They're seen as more worthy victims. Now, what's happening is awful. It is awful. It should be investigated as a war crime. I also think it's the case that were this happening to a mosque, some of the international response would be a lot more muted in Western countries.